Interesting one. Why did God leave it so late to teach other religions the truth about things spiritual? We're going to explore this idea tonight. I'm going to take you through. I'm going to take you through the eons of church history as we talk about this, and share quite a number of quotes from Swedenborg with you, which I'll have on the screen. So I'll start off with this question. What is the church? How would you define this in Swedenborg's terms, if you know?
Well, I would say it's how we think inside. We're all part of a collective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Others' thoughts on that?
I suppose any sort of human system of worship of God.
Okay. Yeah, Clifford, do you have any thoughts on it particularly?
Persons, not buildings.
Oh, very definitely, yes, not buildings. Quite right.
Mm-hmm.
Quite right. Well, I'll share with you a couple of quotes which talk about, what the church is from Swedenborg's point of view. So he says, first of all, the church cannot exist without doctrinal things. The church is not the church by virtue of matters of doctrine, except insofar as these have the good of life as their end in view. Is a church by virtue of good? For the church to exist, it must be internal and external. Now, there's more here. I'll just add to this. I haven't got a slide for it, but I'll just add these words. It continues on. The internal of the church consists in willing good from the heart and being stirred by an affection for good, while the external of that internal consists in performing such good and doing so in accordance with the truth of faith. So, yeah, that's an interesting point of view. And the last one I've got here is not a church by virtue of its externals, that is, of its religious observances, but by virtue of its internals. For these are the essential realities, the externals merely forms expressing those realities. And then I just want to talk about this idea, the church as a fractal. Now, do you understand what a fractal is?
Sounds to me like something to do with geometry.
Oh, very definitely.
It seems to be, a micro which mirrors or reproduces a macro.
Yes.
If you understand what I'm saying.
Yes. So when you look at something in its most minute form, and then you look at it at a larger form, in a larger way, it's the same basic appearance. So as you pan out to get a larger view of something, it still appears the same basic pattern. As you pan in and focus in on something, it appears the same as the whole. Now, this is the way Swedenborg talks about the church. So a couple of quotes for you here. Everyone who leads a good life in charity and faith is a church and is a kingdom of the Lord. He is, for that reason, also called a temple and a house of God too. Those who are churches individually, no matter how remote from one another they may be, constitute one church collectively. And in the Lord's eyes, the entire church is like a human being. For the Lord's heaven, with which the church acts as one, is in his eyes seen as one total human being. For the individual member of the church is a miniature heaven, church, and Lord's kingdom. So it's quite an interesting idea. that Swedenborg presents, the idea that, you know, we are a church in ourselves. Well, if we are a church, of course, we have all those characteristics of, you know, being based on good. But then the collection appears together as a single individual. And when Swedenborg talks about heaven and describes heaven, he's talking in these sorts of terms as well. So, one of the things Swedenborg shares with us is that religion has existed from ancient times. And I'm just going to take you through part of Doctrine of Sacred Scripture, paragraph 117. Religion has existed from ancient times, and the inhabitants of the world have everywhere known of the existence of God and something of the life after death, not on their own or owing to their own acumen, but from the ancient word and later from the Israelite word. From these two sources, religions have spread to Southeast Asia and its islands, through Egypt and Ethiopia into African kingdoms, and from the maritime regions of Asia to Greece, and from there to Italy. So that's a well-known idea in Swedenborg's work, the idea that, you know, religion has existed from ancient times. However, he also talks in the same paragraph about an inevitable decline. So continuing from where we left off there. However, because the word could be written only in representational terms, namely in terms of such things as are found in the world, which correspond to heavenly things and so symbolize them, therefore the religions of many nations were turned into idolatrous ones, and in Greece into myths, where divine attributes and predicates became so many gods, over which the people set a supreme one that they called Jove, after the name Jehovah. But of course he talks about this decline in various other places as well. So true Christian religion. There are various ways in which a church comes to an end. It happens principally through circumstances which cause falsity to look like truth. And when this happens, the good, which is inherently good, which is called spiritual good, can no longer exist. What is then believed to be good is only natural good, the product of a moral life. The reason for truth coming to an end and good with it is principally the two natural loves which are diametrically opposed to the two spiritual loves. These are called self-love and love of the world. When self-love is dominant, it is the opposite of love to God. And when the love of the world is dominant, it is the opposite of love towards the neighbour. Self-love is wishing well to no one but oneself, except for selfish reasons, and likewise the love of the world. Once these loves have got a grip, they spread like mortification through the body and stage by stage destroy every part of it. It is clear that such a love attacked past churches from the description of Babylon. In the end, Babylon vaunted itself so much that it not only transferred to itself the Lord's divine power, but also did its best to attract to itself all the riches of the world. Okay, so you've got this idea of this decline that takes place to a church. And you see this reflected again and again in what Swedenborg writes. Now, what he then says is that once a church has declined and really has died, then a new church is established amongst Gentiles. So I'm going to go on. But when the church reaches its close and perishes, the Lord always raises up a new church somewhere else. Yet rarely, if ever, has he done so from the members of the previous church, but from Gentiles who dwelt in ignorance. A different passage here. The church cannot arise anew with any nation until it has been so vastated that no trace of evil or falsity remains in its internal worship. As long as evil is present in internal worship, those goods and truths which constitute its internal worship are obstructed. For as long as evils and falsities are there, goods and truths cannot be received. This becomes clear from the fact that people who have been born into any heresy and who have so confirmed themselves in its falsities as to be entirely persuaded about it can be led only with difficulty, if at all, to receive the truths which are contrary to their falsities. It is different, however, in the case of Gentiles who do not know what the truth of faith is and yet lead charitable lives. So do you get the pattern? Do you understand what he's saying here in terms of, a church which declines and ultimately gets to the point where it no longer contains any good, it no longer teaches anything that is true. Well, the truths that are in it are so falsified you can't really tell what's true and what's false. And that what happens is you can't establish a new and genuine church within that sort of scenario, in those circumstances. It needs to come out of the Gentiles, which are people who don't have any grasp, but they have a very, very limited grasp of truth. But what they do have is charity, is good within their lives. Any questions so far? I'll go on to this. So we have in the book of Daniel, prophecy of Daniel, this image, well-known image, that the dream that Nebuchadnezzar has. And if you remember the story, Nebuchadnezzar has this dream and he wants his magi to interpret the dream, but he wants to know that the magi actually have, connection with the divine. So he says, well, I'm not going to tell you the dream. You have to tell me the dream and the interpretation. Now, of course, they're petrified about this idea because they don't know what Nebuchadnezzar has dreamt. And it's Daniel, the prophet Daniel, who in actual fact reveals the dream, or retells the dream, and then reveals the interpretation. In Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar saw a statue whose head was fine gold, breast and arms were silver, belly and thigh were bronze, feet partly iron, partly clay. And Swedenborg says here, this statue represented consecutive states of the church. Now I'm going to go through each of these different levels he talks about. So first of all, we have the head. The head of gold represented the first state, which was celestial because it was a state of love to the Lord. And then the breast and arms of silver represented the second state, which was spiritual because it was a state of charity towards the neighbour. The belly and thighs of bronze represented the third state, which was a state of natural good meant by bronze. Natural good being love or charity towards the neighbour, as this exists on a lower level than spiritual good. So just note that. It's very similar to the spiritual good, but it's a lower level, a lower kind of it, or a more physical kind, I think, is probably a good way of imagining that. While the feet of iron and clay were the fourth state, which was the state of natural truth meant by iron, and also a state involving complete lack of cohesion with good, which is meant by clay. So you have the legs of iron, and then the feet were a mixture of iron and clay. So in Swedenborg's estimation, this statue represents this cycle of decline from the very highest, the most celestial, the best, the most inward state of the church, right down to the lowest, most corrupt. And we can see this both in terms of the sweep of human history, like the whole sweep of human history, You know, he talks about the celestial being the most ancient church, the spiritual being the ancient church, and so on. But we can also see something of this process, of course, remembering the fractal within each of the church eras themselves. You have the highest, the purest, the most internal at the beginning, and then gradually it declines. Now, here's something that I read. I came across this doing other reading only in the last week, and I thought this was really a very useful passage in terms of answering the question that was put to us. So this is True Christianity, paragraph 700. Again, a reasonably long one, 2 slides, but you get a sense of what's going on here. The reason why this sense has now been revealed for the first time is that Christianity did not before exist except in name, and in the case of some people as a kind of shadow of itself. For up to the present, people have not approached directly and worshipped the Saviour himself as the only God, in whom is the divine Trinity, but have only approached him indirectly. This is not approaching and worshipping, but only reverencing him as the cause on whose account man is saved, not the essential, but an intermediate cause which is below and outside the other. Then he continues, but because real Christianity is now for the first time arising, the new church meant by the New Jerusalem in Revelation is now being established by the Lord. In this, God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are acknowledged as one because they are in one person. It has therefore pleased the Lord to reveal the spiritual sense of the word, so that this church may reap the real benefit of the sacraments of baptism and the Holy Supper. This comes about when people see with the eyes of their spirit, that is, with the understanding, the holiness hidden within them, and grasp this holiness for themselves by the means which the Lord taught us to use in his word. So, we'll go back to our question. Why did God leave it so late to teach other religions the truths about things spiritual?
I think perhaps some of the other religions had such a hold over the people that they were afraid to listen to anything else. I guess that must have been the same. Well, we know it was the same with the Roman Catholic Church that formed just after a few short years after Jesus was crucified. But other religions, some of the very ancient ones like the Jewish faith, the Judaism and all that, and Chinese religion, they had theirs for centuries, and that's how they had made their society on. So I probably think that maybe they wanted to stick to what they knew rather than stick to what they knew, KNEW, rather than take on anything new.
Yeah, we're very good at holding on to whatever it is we believe, however inaccurate, however, even when we're shown, even when it falls apart in front of our eyes, we're very good at holding on to the traditions and the beliefs we've always held. It's quite remarkable, actually.
Yeah.
You watch it happen sometimes and you think, oh, surely you can see by now that that's not working. But say we're very tenacious with our beliefs. Anyone else, any thoughts they want to share on that? A couple more passages to share with you eventually.
Mm.
So the question itself, so it's saying that other religions have found the truth just recently. I'm a bit unsure of what the question is actually asking.
Mm-hmm. I mean, my understanding of the question is that, you know, we talk about Swedenborg's teaching, you know, and everything Swedenborg wrote as being, you know, divine truth in a form. And especially when we talk about things like the inner sense of the word, the Bible. How has it taken the Lord so long after, how has it taken 1,700 years from the establishment of Christianity for the Lord then to reveal the inner sense of the word? Why wait for that amount of time? That's my sense of what the question's asking.
And it's a good question. I kind of think of the spiritual history of mankind as being like that of the individual, and what I kind of consider to be a spiritual as opposed to maybe a celestial understanding, which Swedenborg outlines quite clearly. I think you can sort of put it in a different phasing so that you can think of the original Christian church as being like humanity's spiritual adolescence, when it's part child, part adult, and the adulthood of humanity, spiritual adult period of humanity, is now with the new church period that Swedenborg says has started. So it's just a matter of the human race wasn't capable, it didn't have the spiritual, intellectual, or I should say spiritual mental capacity to understand fully all things true, complete spirituality, which is revealed with the inner sense of the word.
Okay. Yep. Anyone else, anything they want to add?
I believe it is because, one of the reasons why it came so late or that late is because of the development of printing by Gutenberg.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. People never had the Bible to read, and lots of people throughout the world couldn't read or write. There were only like a select few in society that could read or write, but the Bible was kept purely within the confines of the sort of like leaders of the religion, and no one knew about it. It wasn't widely known.
Yeah. So
As Clifford said, 1600s, I think the Gutenberg press came in when the Bible first went into print. And the printing machine, which was the Gutenberg press, managed to print copies of it for other people.
And then I suppose humanity was not ready to accept these ideas. That's also a fact, according to me.
Yes. Let me just share one more passage that I've got. I'm going to do it this way, so hopefully it's a good size for you to read. So it's Heavenly Secrets 2995, and again, it's 2 slides for this. It's reasonably long. Because members of the most ancient church saw in everything belonging to the natural order something spiritual and celestial, so much so that natural things served them simply as objects for thinking about spiritual and celestial things, they were for that reason able to talk to angels and so be present with them in the Lord's kingdom in the heavens at the same time as they were in his kingdom on earth, which is the church. Thus, with them, natural things were joined to spiritual and wholly corresponded. It was different, however, after those times, when evil and falsity began to reign, that is, after the Golden Age, when the Iron Age began, because at that time correspondence did not exist any longer. Heaven was closed. It ceased to exist so completely that men scarcely wished to know whether there was anything spiritual. Indeed, they did not wish at length to know that there was a heaven or a hell or a life after death. So, he talks about just this idea of decline that goes on. So, in terms of my answer to this question, I guess there's a couple of things. One is this picture of decline that Swedenborg paints. If we go, so, Swedenborg lays out this, as I said before, as the spiritual history of humanity from its beginning right up to the end of the Christian Church, really. And that celestial state, that very high state, that idea of people being open to the spiritual world in such a way that they had communication with angels, almost like face to face. You imagine the way Swedenborg was talking about his own experience of living in two worlds at once. Well, everybody's doing that in this celestial state. And there's not so much a knowledge of things as just an inherent perception of, so I see such and such a thing, and it automatically speaks to me of some spiritual quality. So there's no knowledge of it, it just manifests to me. I just have an innate grasp of what it's talking about. And then gradually we move into this spiritual state which requires something more of knowledge, and then natural good and so on. And we just are gradually declining. So one of the things Swedenborg paints when he's talking about these ideas is really that he's not so much revealing something new as representing something that has been lost. So the celestial people, the most ancient church, had a grasp of these things. They wouldn't have codified or written it down or anything like that. They didn't have writing in that way, but they knew it. They just inherently knew all of these things. Those knowledges were collected over time, but that collection is part of that decline into a lower state. But even then, beyond that, it gets lost. In actual fact, he talks about it being corrupted. If you know the story, the Exodus story, where Moses goes to speak to Pharaoh first, and you know the story where he throws his staff down, for example, and it becomes a snake. And the magicians of the court of Pharaoh do exactly the same thing. And at that point in Arcana Celestia, Swedenborg talks about this, how magic is a corruption of the correspondences that were known by the ancient peoples. And because they corrupted it, then the Lord actually led us to the point where we had to forget those things because they had become corrupted, and we couldn't regain any knowledge of them without also regaining the corruption that was inherent in the knowledge. So it had to be lost. It had to be completely forgotten. And then we work our way further and further down this cycle until we are absolutely, utterly corrupt. And then out of that ignorance can be reborn a new revelation of those correspondences. So we had to get to a certain point in that decline before something new can re-emerge out of it. Wayne, you were talking about the progress of the individual, Swedenborg talks in similar ways that the individual state. You think about the baby. He talks about a new baby being born and being surrounded by angels, And I've had friends who said, you know, well, I can see the way that a baby seems to be communicating off in the air with, you know, beings. Um, but then eventually they will focus down on their parents particularly, and they lose that very early state, and then they start learning. So he talks about this statue also representing the progress of the individual human as they grow, as we grow. Um, and then ultimately, of course, do you remember what happens to this statue at the end of the dream?
Yes, a rock crushes it. Yep.
Yes, yes. So there's a rock which is not hewn by human hands,
Yeah.
uh,
Okay.
which destroys it completely, and then that rock becomes this great mountain, and that's the final stage. That's the rebuilding. So the statue, the progress so far has to be just completely destroyed. There's nothing good left in it whatsoever. And then this great mountain is, which says it fills the whole world, is formed out of this rock. And that rock is, of course, truth. And it's the divine truth of the word. And it's also, you know, it's the incarnation of the Lord and re-establishing the new, well, re-presenting what was lost, but in a new context in the way that it can be refound, rediscovered without it being corrupted in the same way as it had before.
The age of reason also.
Yeah. What in
Uh,
particular about that?
well, it uh, it was happening at the time of Revelation. No?
Yes, very definitely. Yes.
Mhm.
And this is where it ties in with what Wayne was saying, you know, about we, as a human race, we had to develop to the point where these could be laid out in rational terms.
Yeah.
So if you think about those very early terms, the very early stages in infancy, there's some sort of a grasp of it, but it's not an intellectual grasp. We have to go through this whole state then to be given an intellectual grasp of the concepts that are being presented. So it's a very different way of understanding or grasping the same principles, but they are nevertheless the same principles.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that whilst we, well, the church has declined spiritually over time. And that corresponds to, I suppose, the individual. You know, initially the baby is very well, like you say, it's seeing the angels, and you know, over time we lose that ability, and our awareness goes from the spiritual more and more onto the natural. You know, we learn more natural things, and our understanding of the natural world increases. You know, so that we can then, by the time we become adults, we're able to fully look after ourselves.
Yes.
So there is an increase on the in life naturally, whilst at the same time there is the deterioration of the spiritual state.
Yes.
So they run in tandem with each other, those declines and ascendings.
Yes.
And you know, can almost be seen as there's kind of like a complementarity there, or compensation, or something. It's not, in other words, it's not all, in a sense, it's not all a bleak or bad picture, because whilst spiritually we're declining, naturally we're ascending.
Yes, yes. And it's there as it's intended as a foundation for a new spiritual life to be built on top of it. Yeah. So I haven't talked about this tonight, but Swedenborg talks about the innocence of ignorance, which is the childlike state, and then the innocence of wisdom, which is the elder, the wise man, the wise woman, the person who has gone through all of those states of life and rebuilt a new spirituality, a new heart and a new mind on the foundations of that natural experience. And it's the other thing about it, that wisdom and the innocence of wisdom is a conscious choice for innocence, whereas the baby, the innocence of ignorance, is not a conscious choice. It's all they know. Someone who's reached that latter state of the innocence of wisdom has seen all the pleasures of the flesh, if you like, and all the wonders of the world, and still chooses innocence. And that's the goal. But you can't get to that goal without having gone through that degeneration cycle as well. Otherwise, you just stay in the innocence of ignorance, which you can't. Even infants who die in infancy, they still have to go through something of that in the spiritual world. They still have to reach the innocence of wisdom. So that's the goal, the innocence of wisdom. But there's very definitely a process we have to go through to get there.
Yeah, and it's interesting that each stage, Swedenborg says that they all become corrupt, they all deteriorate, but I think he makes the point that that's in fact necessary in order for the person to move on to the next required stage of life. Otherwise, your fascination with that stage would hold you back.
Yeah. So yes, it needs to become corrupt, and we need to see its corruption. That's another thing. So the church doing the seven churches, the letters to the churches at the beginning of Revelation. It's my sense of that now is very much there's two cycles. But I mean, we're reaching the last two, the last two churches. We're doing Philadelphia this week and Laodicea next month, and they're both. Philadelphia is the best and Laodicea is the worst of the lot, right at the end. But it's very definitely it's this. There's an ascending series and there's a descending series, and they're both going together, and you need both of them. So to do the ascent, you need to see the corruption of the descent. That's very definitely my sense of things. And it's interesting that Philadelphia, which is the best, is the second last, and Laodicea, which is the worst, is the last. You would hope it would finish on a high note, but I think actually it does in a kind of a way, which I'll be talking about next month. Next month or the month after? Maybe it's the month after. But yeah, it's very definite that dual. So from the beginning, which is the church at Ephesus, there's an ascent and there's a descent that goes through all of them, and we go through both. Oh well, we can go through both. Either that or we go just down.